I'm Ray Suarez, and you're listening to On Shifting Ground. Believe it or not, another election season is upon us. With the town halls, the think pieces, and of course, endless tweets, it's going to be a wild ride, and marginalized groups are preparing to assert their voices once again. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, a group frequently abbreviated as AAPI, are America's fastest-growing demographic group, with numbers projected to triple by 2060. And yet for decades, they've been the least likely racial minority to hold political office, accounting for less than 1% of elected leaders across all levels of government. But in the past 2 years, Americans of Asian descent garnered a series of political wins, especially in America's big cities. With the recent gains by Asian American candidates, I find myself thinking about another candidate who faced long odds and another consequential election. It wasn't a contest for the future of the republic, but the outcome of this election would change the course of one man's life. Philip Yun is the CEO of World Affairs, the institution in San Francisco that brings you this show. Philip takes the story from there.
My parents came to the United States right after the Korean War. Their intent was to get a scholarship, get smart, learn all these things, and go back to help Korea. That was the idea. My parents were both scientists. My whole family was scientists, so it was always sort of granted or understood that I was going to be a scientist. And I grew up in a small town in Ohio, very few people of color, let alone Asians and Korean Americans. And I decided I was going to run for student council president. It was just something I decided that I wanted to do. For whatever reason, I was always interested in government and things like that. So I decided to run for student council president, and my childhood nemesis bully decided to run against me. We grew up in the same neighborhood in northern Appalachia, and for whatever reason, he was the kid who would call me all of these racial names, Chinese, Japanese, always the one bullying me, ever since I got to Ohio when I was in the 3rd grade. He was known within the whole school as kind of a jerk, mouthing off, not great at school. And so we both decided to run for student council president. And I found out later that teachers had come up to the teacher who was in charge of the election saying, you can't let this guy win. You can't let, let's call him Mike, win over Philip because he's the school bully. He gives everybody trouble. Philip is this exemplary student, right? He should be elected. But the teacher said, hey, this is an election. I'm not going to rig it. So I had my friends who were my campaign manager, and we had a treasurer. And the campaign slogan that we had was, Yun is the one. And we made these little stickers that we put them on. Now, the proper pronunciation of my name in Korea is Yun. But I'm in southeastern Ohio, and no one could say it that way. And so it was just easy to say Yun because that's the way it was spelled. It rhymes with fun, and that's what we did. So Yun is the one and Yun is fun, or something like that. Those were the slogans. So the 6th and 7th grade students voted. It was paper ballot, and it was probably announced the next day. I was very nervous about it. I remember hearing on the intercom,
"We have results. It was a very close election. And the next student council president for Athens Middle School is Philip Yun."
Everyone in my class screamed and yelled. I won by, I think it was 15 votes. So pretty close. I had to do the assembly thing. And so I had to go out in front of, 900 students. I was not that tall. I mean, I'm not, crazy tall right now, but I'm a little bit above average. But I was tiny back then. And so for me to get up onto the lectern, they had to put a set of telephone books or something like that. So I had to stand on that to rise above and get to the microphone. I was 12 when the election happened. So let's say almost 50 years later, We're in California. Everybody was together. Our families, my brother, sister, their kids. It was during the holidays, and we were just talking about Athens because we had just come back from there a year before, a family trip. And my mom basically told me that if I had not won that election, if I had not won that 8th grade election, they were going to move to Korea permanently. To her, it was so clear I should be the 8th grade student council president compared to the competition. And that if I wasn't elected, then they were convinced that I, as a Korean American and a minority, would never be able to advance to my full potential in American society. And I was sort of gobsmacked. I think everybody was stunned when we heard that. The irony and the sad part of it is that my mom now has dementia, so she's not going to remember anything. But my dad verified all of this. They were preparing to go on a sabbatical leave during my 9th grade year. And during that period of time, South Korea was reaching out to the Korean diaspora all over the world. And they were saying to people, come back to Korea. We need your talent. We need your education to make Korea better. And by the way, we're going to offer you amazing jobs. So my dad was kind of being courted in that way. And so they were talking about, if this doesn't work, if he doesn't get elected, he can't get a fair shake here. He will not be able to thrive here as a minority. And we're going to leave because we have this amazing offer. Just the regard that they had for us. I mean, the reason why they stayed in the United States was because they thought we could have a better life. I was fortunate enough to be involved in negotiations between the United States and North Korea and in diplomacy with Japan and South Korea at the highest levels. Sometimes I had to pinch myself that as a Korean American, I was there, right? I was probably the first Korean American that had such a high-profile position. This is completely different now. I was at the cusp of a transition point. I like to say we all sort of work on the shoulders of others, and I do believe that that opened up opportunities for people later on. I say it was the most important election for me because it really determined the trajectory of my adult life. To the extent that I've had any success in my life and I've contributed to making this world better and our society better, that's really a tribute to that opportunity, for sure.
That was Philip Yun, CEO of World Affairs in San Francisco, and he's helped make room for future generations of Asian American leaders. Alex Lee is one such leader. Serving a majority Asian district in the heart of Silicon Valley, Lee is a politician who made history for being California's youngest Asian American state legislator, as well as the first openly bisexual state legislator. He ran on issues like housing, affordable education, and challenging corporate influence on politics. Lee spoke with us from San Jose, California, about his historic achievement and the responsibilities he has to all Americans. Alex Lee, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, talk about seat of the pants. I mean, it would be difficult to become an assembly member at any time, but during the pandemic, it must have been just bizarre.
Bizarre, surreal, a lot of sense of urgency. And mind you, this was my first ever elected official position. I was sworn in at the age of 25 on the floor of our Golden One Center where the Sacramento Kings play, because that was where we could have social distance ceremony and there were no family members present. And right after that, we went on to talk about how do we get stimulus checks to people, how do we get people tested. I mean, mind you, this is also before vaccines too. So we were figuring out what to do with Zoom school and a whole different paradigm of issues to deal with. And it really showed me how important it is to have people that care and people that understand the individual experience, because the California state budget is in the $260-ish billion budget world. We talk about programs that are in the billions and millions of dollars, and it's easy to forget what I would call the user experience sometimes when we talk about Zoom school or vaccinations or tests or whatever it is. I remember there's so many learning lessons from that.
You mentioned you were 25 when you took the oath. Were you a political kid? Was politics seen as an admirable calling by your parents or something to be avoided?
Well, it was not an option for me growing up. In fact, my mom envisioned that I'd become a doctor, and my dad would think I would follow and become a software engineer or something in tech. My mom was a nurse too. So they envisioned something like that. But, I was not a very good student chemistry or biology, and I thought that kind of ruled myself out. And I wasn't too big fan on the computer science stuff. So when I was applying to colleges in 2012, it was the re-election campaign of Barack Obama, and I was kind of inspired by that. And I said, ooh, that seems like something I can help people with. And never looked back. I did political science, interned, and worked in the state capitol, and then eventually ran when I started running at the age of 23. And here I am now at the age of 27, a couple of years later, and haven't looked back, haven't changed course.
So was it the possibilities of the role rather than any one issue that pushed or pulled you into running for public office?
Well, I would say, my experience being legislative staff showed me in a very real sense what I could do in this job. And at the end of the day, these things are jobs, right? It's like if you can't envision yourself doing the job, you shouldn't really be doing these things. So I really understood the mechanics of it, the day-to-day and what to do, which of course paid off really immensely being a young elected. I knew how the process worked. In fact, my first bill introduced on the floor in 2021 was a bill to ban corporate donations, and I wrote that one basically myself. But I would say one issue that really pushed me to run was housing affordability. I live in the second most unaffordable place in the country, in the San Jose metropolitan area, and an average home price right now is going for like $1.6 million. And home ownership is one of those things, probably is a distant dream for people like me in my generation, but it's something that really drives so many decisions. Housing insecurity is a huge issue that plagues California, especially the Bay Area, and it's something I live through personally. Like, I live at home. That's the only way, even as a legislator, that's the only way I can afford to have a place up here in Sacramento while I'm here half the time and back home. And even though I got teased for a lot, it's the reality of so many people, not just young people, a lot of people who, out of economic survival, have to live with different generations of their family.
You mentioned that you were staff. You were already familiar with the workings of government. Heck, you've already written a bill. But are there almost inevitably things that now that you're on the inside, you understand a lot better about how the assembly works, about politics than you did 2 years ago?
Oh yeah, lots and lots. I learned quite quickly in a bit surreal way. So, I always came from a policy background. I thought about the empirical evidence, about facts and figures, and studying comparative studies and all. But politics is not so much how persuasive the truth is sometimes. It's how persuasive you just generally are. And I've come to find that relationships matter a lot, who says what, and all those kind of things. I think the general public would probably be a little alarmed sometimes how much of it is relational, but it's human, right? I mean, just as your best friend, if they were to ask you for $50, you'd probably be more inclined to do it versus your long-distance cousin you've never talked to, right? It's just human nature. But human nature plays so much in democracy. Democracy is always said to not be a perfect and a pretty messy system, but it's a pretty good system we have that includes a lot of voices. And that's something I've come to learn a lot, is that to figure out how to get the right messages across to people and persuade them in different ways rather than just saying, hey, look at this case study from this academic journal, which are things that can appeal to me, but doesn't appeal to everyone else.
Almost every article on your election and your entry into public office refers to you as a Gen Z legislator, first of your generation in Sacramento, and so on. Does it matter? Are there issues before state government that you're particularly sensitive to, particularly able to speak to, than someone even just 10 years older, someone who's pushing 40 instead of 30, who may not get these things the same way you do?
I think it matters a lot. And inevitably, as we have even younger legislators than myself, and eventually, people born in 2000s who are going to be serving in, actually in some states might already be serving in office, it's generational twofold, right? One is that we must live with all the consequences of our actions or inactions as relates to all social issues, climate change, or what have you. We have to live through that. It's a whole visceral, obviously everyone has to live through that, but we have long time to live with these consequences. And we are trying, I think, and I think you're seeing this a lot with young activists, Gen Zs especially, is that we think in the long term, right? What are the big investments and the big systemic changes we have to do to reap the benefits of that later on, not short-term thinking. Secondly, I think we have a different comfortability and understanding of the digital age we live in. I represent the bedroom communities of Silicon Valley, but still, I think I was raised on the internet. I understand a lot of the scare we had in the 90s and early 2000s, and now we have the new scare about ChatGPT, AI, all these things. And, we have to figure out, how do we regulate? How do we live with these tools that have been unleashed? Because once they're out of the bag, they're out of the bag. But we have to figure out how to live with these and safeguard ourselves against these new technologies that could really innovate and change society for the better or for the worse. Infamously, I think the congressional hearings for big tech, they would ask these questions and then young people just cringe, just the way they describe Snapchat or Twitter or Facebook. But we have that just basic understanding, but also the principles of the internet. When you're raised on the internet and information is your fingertips, it's a different experience really growing up. And I think this is here to stay, right?
Well, I'm sold. It sounds like you make a good case for the value of your age in a chamber like the California Assembly. But these same articles, and there are a lot of them, mention not only your age, but your race and ethnic identity, your sexuality. Do you have to strike a balance? I mean, after all, you are in real life all these things, but at the same time, not all your constituents are. You also don't want to be hemmed in, flattened, stereotyped by a few data points. Do you have to remind people that, hey, yeah, voice of a generation, fine, but also the assembly member for the 24th district, and I got real bread and butter things to talk about here.
Absolutely. Identity is totality of who you are, right? I'm more than just some of my horns. I'm more than just being the first bisexual state legislator, more than just young, more than just being Asian, et cetera, all these things. But all identities inform, I think, a worldview in some way. I think about a lot from my hometown, Milpitas. It's a town of like 60,000 people now. It keeps growing really fast. So we only had one high school town for, a city that's pretty populous, I would say. And my graduating class was like 1,000 people. But I remember early on thinking, wow, this is such a lesson in universality. There are people who are rich. There are people who are poor. There are people who are really sportsy, people who are really nerdy, people of all backgrounds. And we all went to the same exact school. And just because we were all from the same community. And I think really in the end of the day, it's that we have to champion universal issues. Our identities inform some of the way we look at the world. At the end of the day, I think it's about fighting for collective liberation, collective happiness, and that everyone should have housing, everyone should have education. I think about it that way, universality in everyone. And that's really what the progressive message is about. It's about everyone should have everything kind of thing. Like no one should be excluded from this and no one, not just because this group and whatnot, but that's really the bread and butter issues we kind of talk about, is that everyone should have these things. And I think I owe that a lot to my upbringing in Milpitas too.
For people who aren't familiar with the district, tell us about it. Give us a quick thumbnail tour.
Yeah, so my district is Southern Alameda County and Northern Santa Clara County. So it's the cities of Fremont, Newark, Sunol is an unincorporated town, but Milpitas, my hometown, and Northern San Jose. And some folks might know about the local businesses like Tesla or Facebook or all these places that are there. But really, it's a great community, incredibly diverse. In fact, I have the most Asian Pacific Islander district in the entire state of California. 60%, 6 out of 10 people are Asian American in this district, and I grew up here. And I would say it's a really great community where people come from all over the world, and it's growing. I would say even 30, 40 years ago, it wasn't this Asian before, but now you got people from India, from Japan, from China, East Asia, all over the place. And even the Asian diaspora itself is so big and different that there's total different cultural politics and subtext that exists now too in this world. Silicon Valley, as people like to refer to it, my hometown Milpitas was called the gateway to Silicon Valley. It's a lot of people who ended up, funny enough, working in service sector, teachers, or they became tech sector, right? Work at Google, work at all the big firms. And that's the kind of community we come from. And generally everyone's, I would say, is pretty progressive too.
Remarkable that it's the highest percentage Asian population of all the districts in California, because California, to begin with, has by far the largest Asian American population of the 50 states, exponentially so, almost 7 million people, which by itself would outstrip most state populations in total. Does that put a particular responsibility on the legislature to be heard nationally on Asian American issues? There are a lot of things that really don't fall legally and technically into the responsibility of a state legislature like yours, but are they inevitably in your range of responsibility because California has this large Asian population and you yourself are an Asian elected official?
Well, absolutely, we do. California is a nation state in of itself. It was its own nation, it would be the fourth largest economy in the world, just behind Japan. And we're pretty close right now, too. And we, of course, are the most populous, too. Although that could change if we don't get our housing crisis in order. We do. We have a national, if not international, responsibility. We have this saying, I think, quite proudly, is that so goes California, so goes the nation. And it's because when we change things about industry, right, we have different environmental standards, different labor standards, because we're the most populous state, and most important economically, they have to change their practices nationally. They can't just have a California standard and then a Nevada standard suddenly. It doesn't make sense for them. So we're very, very impactful. And so it's really important that we have a big voice about championing civil rights and all things we do to protect the nation, because we have to. We have to do that, and it's our responsibility for people of color and Asian communities in states that are very hostile to them. There's a lot of red baiting right now that happens when you talk about TikTok or foreign ownership or Chinese students, all these things. These are all red baiting, right? I think my generation has not lived through yet, or maybe we're in the precipice of it, right? But it's a new Cold War. There's people who would be chomping at a bit to go to another war with another global superpower right now and want to escalate that. But I think in California, especially in my community, we do not want something like that, and we don't want to victimize groups like that. In California, we have our fair share of experience of what happens when you victimize the API community. California Exclusion Act, it originated, a lot of these anti-Chinese laws, they originated in California first, and then they became federal. The unjust incarceration and internment of Japanese Americans, a lot of that stuff happened right here in my community. San Jose State University, that was a gathering point, right, where people were gathered up and then sent off to camps. This is a long, dark stain in our country, and a lot of that started in California. And sometimes I think about the responsibility someone like I have, because if you think about it, for generations and generations, California state legislatures before me, they'd probably be completely reviled that there was a young, queer Asian person sitting at that desk where they used to serve.
Well, one of the big national trends is that recent decades have seen such an uptick in Asian immigration that Asian immigrants will outnumber Latinos by somewhere in the 2030s. It's a remarkable thing, given the fact that for much of a century, between the late 19th and mid 20th century, Asians couldn't even immigrate to the United States and were forbidden by statute from naturalizing. It's a shameful history. It's one we really have to remind ourselves of from time to time. But here it comes, post-1965, roaring ahead. People from South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. It is remarkable. It's going to demand that we rethink, when somebody says, well, hey, think of an average American, the image that pops into your mind. And you, if you hang in with this way of life for a while, are going to be a big part of that mix. Ready for the job?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think as time goes on, I'll be more and more reflective of California now, but more and more reflective of this nation. And I also think and credit, obviously, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which was prominently led by African Americans, by Black leaders, that allowed for people like me and my family to get over here. And that's why I talk about collective liberation, is that when all people of color, especially marginalized people, are bounded together in collective success, we are all so much more successful for this. Like, I even think about in 2021, when there was rising anti-Asian hatred, we as the API caucus, we led on what's called the equity budget. We got over $165 million. All that money, of course, is to combat anti-Asian hate, but the majority of that went to community-based organizations to foster understanding. We didn't double down on failed war on crime or criminalizing people. We said the best antidote for hate and misunderstanding is love and understanding, right? Teaching people about each other. And who better to do that job than our community-based organizations? And that's who we invested in. And it doesn't go specifically and exclusively to API community-based organizations, but to everyone. And everyone is able to access that. So when one group leads a charge and we all ally together, we all succeed.
On this program, during the pandemic, there were Asian American guests who spoke of a rising feeling of vulnerability, that they weren't being adequately protected from those who would harm them. As the pandemic has subsided, do those feelings remain? Are they part of the residue that's left over from that terrible time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people's concerns about their safety and hatred, these things all bubbled up, right? A lot of ugly things came out during the pandemic, and sometimes people's prejudice. Look, we had a former president of the United States who just went on watched TV every day and just called it the China virus, right? It's quite blatant. It's not even dog whistling. That just is blatant racism. And that stoking of it and making it mainstream, I think, really hurt it. When at a time when our nation was hurting, there were people who were fanning the flames for any sort of division possible, and that stuff lingers today, right? People and Asian Americans have every right to feel that this country looks at us as perpetual foreigners, looks at us with distrust and hatred sometimes, because it's true. There's that sentiment that still feels out there, but we do the hard work of understanding, of bridging, and having what I truly believe is a multicultural, pluralistic democracy, as many other countries in the world are trying to embrace too, and we can be that. It doesn't have to be one type of person looks American. We all are American.
That idea right now is under pressure. There's no shortage of people saying that the essential character of the United States will be altered by these rising new populations, that once people of European descent are not the numerical majority in the United States anymore, something valuable will have been lost. Is that something you just have to live through? Does time take care of that? Is it organically answered by the way we live in the country, or does that have to be taken on and named by people like you, like others?
Demographic change is inevitable, but that doesn't mean, reflecting on the past, that just because a certain group becomes a minority or majority, the power dynamic changes. Power does not surrender itself naturally. We have to deliberately, intentionally make our society much more inclusive, not just tolerant, right, but inclusive, actively inclusive and understanding and accepting of other people. That's going to take a lot of work. Just because we're in the majority doesn't mean that people of color will have all the rights and privileges and power in the world equitably and equally. You only have to look at our own past, European colonialism and imperialism. It doesn't mean that just because the demographics are on our side, the power will change. But that's what we're leading in California. We're being very deliberate about how we celebrate holidays, how we talk about other communities, and how we include and bring more people, add on more people into our democratic system, rather than some other states that are kind of like clinging to an age that's gone by. They say, this age was better. We should go back to that era, right? And, they're coded, sometimes very coded or not so coded racist signals out there, but this is the reality. Demographics will catch up, the world will catch up, but will there be everyone that accepts it? We have to be active about that. We have to be active, we have to be deliberate.
Alex Lee, a great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks a lot, and good luck with the work.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. The first half of today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, and Andrew Stelzer. The second half was produced by Elise Manukian, Joanne Jennings, and Teresa Katsarillas. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.